When Derek Lawson began his ascent of Denali on March 15, 2018, the 33-year-old mechanical engineer from Denver had no way of knowing that his carefully planned solo expedition would become one of the most disturbing mysteries in the mountain's recorded history. Derek was not a reckless climber seeking cheap thrills or social media fame. He was a methodical professional who had spent 3 years preparing for this moment, training his body and mind for what many consider the ultimate test of North American mountaineering. His disappearance on March 22 would launch an investigation that would uncover a web of deception, obsession, and ultimately murder on the frozen slopes of Alaska's most unforgiving peak. Derek's passion for mountaineering had begun during his college years at Colorado State University, where weekend trips to the Front Range had gradually evolved into more ambitious expeditions across the Rocky Mountains. After graduation, his engineering career had provided both the financial means and the analytical mindset that served him well in the mountains. He approached climbing with the same systematic precision he brought to designing industrial machinery, breaking down complex routes into manageable components and identifying potential failure points before they could become fatal problems. His climbing resume was impressive without being flashy, including successful ascents of Mount Rainier, Denali's smaller cousin Mount McKinley, and several technical peaks in the Canadian Rockies. The decision to attempt Denali solo was not made lightly. Derek had originally planned to climb with his longtime climbing partner, Jake Morrison, but a serious knee injury had forced Jake to withdraw from the expedition just weeks before their planned departure. Rather than postpone the trip or seek a replacement partner, Derek chose to proceed alone. He had the technical skills, the physical conditioning, and most importantly, the mental discipline that solo mountaineering demanded. His preparation had been exhaustive, including winter survival courses, high-altitude training in Colorado's 14ers, and extensive study of Denali's weather patterns and route conditions. Derek's climbing plan was conservative and well-researched, following the standard West Buttress route that accounts for roughly 70% of all Denali attempts. He planned an 18-day expedition with built-in buffer time for weather delays, carrying 22 days of food and fuel to ensure adequate safety margins. His gear list was meticulous, including redundant safety systems, emergency shelter, and communication equipment that would allow him to maintain contact with the outside world throughout his climb. Every item in his pack had been weighed, tested, and justified as essential for his survival in one of the world's most hostile environments. The flight from Talkeetna to Denali Base Camp on March 15 was routine, handled by veteran pilot Bruce Hammond, who had been flying climbers onto the Kahiltna Glacier for 15 years. Hammond remembered Derek specifically because of his thorough preparation and professional demeanor during their pre-flight briefing. Derek had asked intelligent questions about weather patterns, landing conditions, and emergency evacuation procedures, demonstrating the kind of serious preparation that Hammond respected in his clients. The pilot noted that Derek seemed confident but appropriately cautious, exactly the attitude that successful Denali climbers needed to possess. For the first 5 days, Derek's expedition proceeded flawlessly according to his predetermined schedule. His satellite communication device sent regular position updates to the National Park Service, each transmission confirming his location and progress up the mountain. His messages to his sister Amanda in Denver were brief but reassuring, typical of Derek's efficient communication style. Day 3, weather good, made cash at 9,500, feeling strong. These digital breadcrumbs would later become crucial evidence in reconstructing his final week on the mountain. Derek established his first camp at 7,800 feet on March 16, then spent the following days acclimatizing and moving supplies higher up the mountain. His progress was steady and measured, showing none of the rushed decision-making that often led to tragedy on Denali. On March 19, he successfully established his second camp at 11,200 feet, positioning himself for the challenging climb to 14,200 feet, the traditional high camp from which most summit attempts are launched. His satellite updates indicated he was on schedule and in good health, with no signs of altitude sickness or equipment problems. The weather forecast for March 21 called for a brief but intense storm system to move through the Alaska Range, bringing high winds and heavy snow to the upper elevations of Denali. Derek's planned itinerary accounted for such weather delays, and his last communication on the evening of March 20 indicated he intended to wait out the storm at his 11,200-foot camp before continuing his ascent. According to his submitted climbing plan, he should have remained in his tent until conditions improved, then moved to high camp on March 23 or 24, depending on the duration of the storm. But Derek Lawson never reached 14,200 feet. His final satellite transmission was recorded at 2:33 a.m. on March 22, during the height of the predicted storm. The coordinates placed him at 12,800 feet, nearly 2,000 feet above his established camp and moving in a direction that corresponded to no known route on the mountain. The transmission was brief and garbled, lasting only a few seconds before cutting out completely. After that signal, Derek vanished from all electronic monitoring systems, disappearing into the white void of the Alaskan wilderness. When Derek failed to make his scheduled check-in on March 23, the National Park Service initiated standard protocols for overdue climbers. A ranger attempted to contact him via satellite communicator but received no response. They called Amanda in Denver, who confirmed that she had received no communication from her brother since his March 20 message. Initial concern focused on equipment failure, a common problem in Denali's harsh environment where electronic devices could fail catastrophically due to extreme cold or impact damage. By March 25, 3 days overdue, Derek's situation had escalated to critical status. The storm had passed, leaving clear skies and ideal conditions for both climbing and search operations. A National Park Service helicopter equipped with thermal imaging equipment was dispatched to conduct an aerial search of Derek's planned route and the surrounding terrain. The helicopter crew, led by veteran ranger Tom Bishop, began their systematic search at Derek's last known camp location, expecting to find either Derek himself or evidence of what had gone wrong. The discovery of Derek's abandoned camp sent immediate alarm through the search operation. His tent was found intact and properly secured, showing no damage from the recent storm. Inside, investigators found Derek's sleeping bag still laid out, his cooking equipment arranged as if he had been preparing a meal, and most of his high-altitude climbing gear neatly organized in stuffed sacks. But Derek was nowhere to be found, and several critical pieces of equipment were missing from the tent. The missing items painted a puzzling picture. Derek's climbing harness was gone, along with his ice axe, crampons, and headlamp. His satellite communicator was also absent, as was a significant portion of his emergency food supply. Most concerning was the discovery that Derek's emergency shelter, a lightweight but crucial piece of survival equipment, remained in his tent. The pattern suggested he had left his camp deliberately and with specific equipment, but had failed to take some of the most important items for survival in a storm. The official search operation that followed was one of the largest mounted on Denali that spring. Elite mountain rescue teams from both the National Park Service and civilian search and rescue organizations deployed across multiple sectors of the mountain. The search was supported by helicopter assets, fixed-wing aircraft providing broader area coverage, and sophisticated ground-penetrating radar equipment designed to locate objects buried under snow. The operation was complicated by the same harsh conditions that had likely contributed to Derek's disappearance, including sudden weather changes and technical terrain that challenged even experienced rescue personnel. For 10 days, search teams scoured every accessible slope, crevasse field, and potential accident site within a 6-mile radius of Derek's camp. They rappelled into ice caves, probed avalanche debris with specialized equipment, and followed every possible route he might have taken during the storm. The search effort was methodical and comprehensive, covering terrain that would normally take experienced climbers days to traverse. Despite the extensive operation, no trace of Derek was found. The official search was suspended on April 4 after rescue teams had exhausted all reasonable possibilities for finding Derek alive. Ranger Bishop, in his final report to the Park Service, concluded that Derek Lawson had most likely fallen into a concealed crevasse during the March 22 storm. The theory was that he had left his tent during the night, possibly due to disorientation caused by altitude sickness or hypothermia, and had fallen through a snow bridge into one of the glacier's many hidden chasms. Such accidents were tragically common on Denali, and the remote location made recovery operations extremely dangerous for search personnel. Derek's disappearance was officially classified as a presumed fatality due to mountaineering accident. His family was notified, his emergency contacts were updated, and his case joined the grim statistics of climbers who had been claimed by North America's highest peak. The mountaineering community mourned the loss of another careful, experienced climber, noting the cruel randomness of mountain accidents that could claim even the most prepared individuals. Memorial posts on climbing forums praised Derek's methodical approach and mourned the waste of such careful preparation ending in tragedy. But as the 2018 climbing season progressed and other expeditions moved through the area where Derek had vanished, questions began to emerge about the official explanation. Experienced guides noted inconsistencies between the supposed accident scenario and the physical evidence found at Derek's camp. The direction indicated by his final satellite transmission suggested uphill movement away from established routes, behavior that seemed inconsistent with a disoriented climber seeking shelter. More puzzling was the selective nature of the equipment he had taken, gear choices that suggested purposeful action rather than confusion or panic. The first significant challenge to the official narrative emerged in early June, when a commercial guiding company discovered evidence that had been overlooked during the initial search. The team from Alpine Adventures, led by veteran guide Rebecca Torres, was establishing a supply cache at 13,400 feet when they noticed something unusual protruding from the snow. Partially buried beneath several months of accumulated snowfall, they found a single climbing glove, high-quality gear that appeared to have been lost recently rather than weathered by years of mountain exposure. Torres immediately recognized the potential significance of the find. The glove was expensive equipment, the type used by serious mountaineers, and its location was nearly 3 miles from Derek's last known camp at an elevation that would have required significant technical climbing to reach. She photographed the glove and its GPS coordinates before carefully extracting it from the snow, noting that the surrounding area showed subtle signs of disturbance beneath the surface snow layers. When Torres reported the discovery to the Park Service upon her return to base camp, Ranger Bishop immediately suspected it might be connected to Derek's disappearance. The glove matched the brand and model listed on Derek's equipment manifest, a detail that was part of standard record-keeping for all Denali climbers. But the discovery location created a new puzzle. If Derek had somehow reached that elevation during the March storm, he would have been climbing in conditions that even expert mountaineers would consider extremely dangerous, if not impossible. The glove was transported to Anchorage for detailed forensic examination. The analysis revealed several disturbing details that deepened the mystery surrounding Derek's final days. The fabric showed recent wear patterns consistent with active climbing use, and traces of Derek's DNA were found on the interior lining. More troubling was the condition of the glove itself. The outer shell showed what appeared to be cut marks, clean slices through the waterproof material that suggested deliberate damage rather than accidental tearing on rock or ice. This evidence prompted a limited reopening of the search effort, focused specifically on the high-altitude area where the glove had been discovered. A team of technical rescue specialists was inserted by helicopter into the search zone, an area of extreme terrain that required advanced climbing techniques just to navigate safely. The landscape was a brutal combination of exposed granite walls, hard-packed snow fields, and hidden crevasses that could swallow a person without warning. On their third day in the expanded search area, the team made a discovery that fundamentally changed the nature of the investigation. Hidden behind a large rock formation at 14,000 feet, they found clear evidence of human activity that had occurred months after the official search had been concluded. The site contained the remains of a small cooking fire, its ashes frozen solid but still clearly visible against the pristine snow. Scattered around the fire were several pieces of debris, including food packaging and what appeared to be fragments of climbing equipment. The debris field was carefully documented and collected as evidence. The food packaging included brands that matched items from Derek's documented supply list, but also contained materials that were not part of his original equipment inventory. Most significantly, the team found pieces of climbing rope that had been deliberately cut into short segments, along with hardware that showed signs of having been modified with tools. The evidence suggested not just human presence at this remote location, but purposeful activity that required time and preparation. The discovery prompted an intensive investigation into the backgrounds of all climbers who had been on Denali during Derek's expedition and the months that followed. The Park Service maintained detailed records of everyone who had obtained climbing permits for the mountain, and investigators began the painstaking process of verifying the identities and activities of each individual. Most climbers checked out as legitimate mountaineers with verifiable backgrounds and normal expedition patterns, but one name emerged as a significant anomaly. Dr. Nathan Cross, who claimed to be a 45-year-old psychiatrist from Seattle, had obtained a climbing permit for a solo expedition that overlapped with Derek's time on the mountain. Cross's application presented an impressive climbing resume, including claimed ascents of major peaks in Alaska, the Himalayas, and South America. But when investigators attempted to verify his credentials, they discovered a pattern of deception that raised immediate red flags. The medical license number Cross had provided on his climbing permit application belonged to a different physician who had died 2 years earlier in an unrelated accident. The climbing references he had listed either led to disconnected phone numbers or individuals who had never heard of Nathan Cross. His claimed employer, a psychiatric practice in Seattle, had no record of anyone by that name, and the address he had provided for his residence turned out to be a vacant office building. Phone records showed that Cross had made numerous calls during his supposed solo expedition on Denali, despite claiming to be climbing without support. The calls were placed to a series of prepaid cell phones that investigators traced to various locations across Alaska and the Pacific Northwest. The pattern suggested a level of coordination and planning that was inconsistent with a typical mountaineering expedition, raising questions about Cross's true purpose on the mountain. A deeper investigation into Nathan Cross revealed that the identity was entirely fabricated, constructed by someone with extensive knowledge of both mountaineering and the bureaucratic systems that governed access to protected wilderness areas. The false identity had been carefully crafted over several years, with a history of climbing permits for various locations across the western United States. Most disturbing was the discovery that wherever Cross had climbed, there had been incidents involving other mountaineers, including equipment thefts, campsite disturbances, and in 2 cases, unexplained disappearances that had never been resolved. The search for Nathan Cross became a priority for investigators, but he had vanished as completely as Derek himself. His climbing permit indicated he should have exited Denali by April 15, but there was no record of his departure from the mountain or his return to any of the airports that served the region. The pilot who had flown him to base camp, Captain Willie Shaw, remembered Cross specifically because of his unusual behavior and excessive questions about flight schedules and other climbers' plans. As investigators compiled more information about Cross's presence on Denali, they began to uncover a timeline that intersected disturbingly with Derek's final week. Cross's permit documentation placed him at 12,000 feet on March 21, the day before Derek's disappearance, and radio communications between various climbing teams included several mentions of an unidentified solo climber who had been seen near other expeditions, often appearing without warning and asking detailed questions about other climbers' routes and schedules. The breakthrough in understanding Cross's role came from an unexpected source. A climbing team from Germany that had been on the mountain during the same period contacted investigators after learning about the case through international mountaineering networks. They had taken photographs during their expedition that included background images of other climbers, and one photo from March 22 showed a figure moving across a distant ridge during the height of the storm that had been raging when Derek disappeared. The figure in the photograph was clearly an experienced mountaineer, moving confidently despite the severe weather conditions that had grounded most other climbers. More importantly, the person appeared to be dragging or carrying a large heavy object that was inconsistent with normal solo climbing equipment. When investigators enhanced the image, they could make out what appeared to be a rescue sled or improvised stretcher, gear that neither Derek nor any other known climber in the area should have been carrying. The timing and location of the photograph placed the unknown climber within a few hundred yards of Derek's last known position, moving away from the area during the exact time window when Derek had sent his final, garbled satellite transmission. The image provided the first concrete evidence that Derek's disappearance might not have been a simple accident, but rather the result of an encounter with someone who had been deliberately hunting other climbers on the mountain. If you're wondering how this investigation unfolded and what dark secrets Denali was hiding, stay with us as we reveal the shocking discoveries that would expose a predator operating in one of the world's most remote locations. The evidence was beginning to paint a picture of premeditated violence, but the worst revelations were still to come. The photograph from the German climbing team marked a turning point in the investigation. No longer was Derek's disappearance being treated as a tragic accident. The case had become a potential homicide investigation, with Nathan Cross emerging as the primary suspect in what appeared to be a carefully planned attack on a fellow climber. But Cross had vanished into the wilderness as completely as his victim, leaving investigators to wonder if Derek was still alive somewhere on the mountain, or if his body lay hidden in one of Denali's countless secret places. waiting to tell its own story of what had happened during those final, terrifying moments of the March storm. The investigation into Nathan Cross intensified throughout the late spring of 2018, as investigators worked to unravel the web of deception surrounding the false identity. Detective Lisa Warren, a criminal investigator with the Alaska State Police who specialized in wilderness crimes, took the lead on what had now become a multi-agency manhunt. Warren's experience with remote area homicides had taught her that perpetrators who operated in wilderness settings often possessed extensive outdoor skills and intimate knowledge of the terrain they used to conceal their crimes. Warren's team discovered that the Nathan Cross identity had been active for nearly 4 years, with climbing permits and wilderness registrations spanning from Alaska to Patagonia. The pattern that emerged was deeply troubling. In every location where Cross had climbed, there had been incidents involving other mountaineers. Sometimes it was equipment that went missing from established camps. Other times it was reports of an aggressive, unstable climber who approached other teams with inappropriate questions about their plans and routes. Most disturbing were the 3 cases where solo climbers had disappeared entirely, their bodies never recovered despite extensive search operations. The first case had occurred in 2015 in the Canadian Rockies, where an experienced ice climber named Robert Hayes had vanished during a solo attempt on a remote peak. Hayes had been an expert mountaineer with decades of experience, but his body was never found despite a massive search effort. The second case was in 2016 in Washington State's North Cascades, where Sarah Collins, a 30-year-old software engineer, had disappeared while attempting a technical solo climb. Like Derek, both Hayes and Collins had been methodical, well-prepared climbers who had simply vanished without explanation. The third case was even more disturbing. In early 2017, just months before Derek's Denali expedition, a climber named Michael Torres had disappeared in Alaska's Wrangell Mountains. Torres had been found alive but severely injured, claiming that he had been attacked by another climber who had robbed him of his equipment and left him to die in a crevasse. Torres described his attacker as a middle-aged man who had approached his camp offering assistance, then had suddenly turned violent. The description Torres provided matched the general physical characteristics of Nathan Cross, but the case had never been solved due to lack of physical evidence. Warren's investigation revealed that Cross had been present in all 3 locations during the relevant time periods, using various false identities but always maintaining the same basic cover story of being a medical professional with extensive mountaineering experience. The pattern suggested a sophisticated predator who had been operating for years, selecting isolated victims in remote locations where crimes could be committed without witnesses and bodies could be hidden where they might never be found. The search for Cross expanded beyond the mountaineering community to include facial recognition technology and financial tracking systems. Investigators discovered that the false identities had been supported by a network of fraudulent credit cards, fake driver's licenses, and carefully constructed employment histories. The level of preparation suggested someone with significant resources and possibly law enforcement or military training in covert operations. As summer arrived and the climbing season on Denali reached its peak, more expeditions began moving through the areas where Derek had disappeared and where evidence of Cross's presence had been found. The Park Service issued discreet bulletins to all climbing teams, asking them to report any unusual discoveries or signs of human activity in remote areas of the mountain. Rangers also increased their monitoring of high-altitude camps, looking for any signs that Cross might still be operating on Denali. The breakthrough came on July 18, 2018, exactly 4 months after Derek's disappearance, when a commercial expedition led by guide Patricia Newman made a discovery that would haunt everyone involved for the rest of their lives. Newman's team was attempting a rarely used variant of the West Buttress route that took them through a remote section of the mountain at approximately 15,200 feet. The area was known for its technical difficulty and unstable snow conditions, which explained why most climbers avoided it in favor of more established routes. Newman was leading her team across a steep snow field when one of her clients, an experienced climber named James Hart, noticed something unusual about the snow texture ahead of them. A roughly circular area approximately 10 feet in diameter showed subtle color variations and density differences that suggested something was buried beneath the surface. Hart's mountaineering experience had taught him to recognize signs of avalanche debris and hidden crevasses, but this disturbance pattern was different from anything he had seen before. Newman called a halt to the team's progress and approached the anomalous area carefully, probing the snow with her ice axe to test its stability. At a depth of approximately 3 feet, her axe encountered something solid that was clearly not rock or ice. Further probing revealed what appeared to be a large object buried in the packed snow, something with a distinctly unnatural shape that didn't belong in the mountain environment. The discovery prompted Newman to make an immediate satellite phone call to the Park Service, reporting the find and requesting guidance on how to proceed. Given the ongoing investigation into Derek's disappearance and the heightened awareness of potential criminal activity on the mountain, Ranger Bishop ordered Newman's team to secure the area and wait for the arrival of investigative personnel. A helicopter carrying forensic specialists and mountain rescue technicians was dispatched immediately from base camp. When the investigation team arrived and began the careful process of excavating the buried object, they uncovered a scene that defied explanation and challenged everything they thought they understood about Derek's fate. Buried upside down in the tightly packed snow, they found Derek Lawson's body, but the circumstances of his burial raised questions that would haunt the investigation for months to come. Derek had been placed in the snow headfirst, his feet pointing toward the surface, in a position that was physically impossible to achieve through any natural accident or avalanche. His body had been deliberately positioned and then covered with snow that had been carefully packed to conceal any surface indication of the burial site. The level of effort required to create such a burial would have taken hours of work in extremely difficult conditions, suggesting a perpetrator with both the physical capability and the psychological motivation to engage in such elaborate concealment. More disturbing were the condition of Derek's body and the equipment found with him. He was still wearing most of his climbing gear, but several items were missing, including his satellite communicator, emergency beacon, and most of his food supplies. His climbing harness showed signs of having been cut and retied, suggesting that he had been restrained at some point. Most shocking was the discovery that Derek's climbing rope had been used to bind his arms and legs, and that he had been buried while still alive, suffocating in the snow rather than dying from injuries sustained in a fall. The forensic examination conducted at the burial site revealed evidence that Derek had survived for some time after his initial disappearance, possibly days or even weeks. His body showed signs of prolonged exposure and malnutrition, but also indicated that he had been receiving some food and water during his captivity. The evidence painted a horrific picture of extended torture and psychological abuse, suggesting that Derek had been kept alive deliberately before finally being murdered and buried in the elaborate grave. Stay tuned as we uncover the final pieces of this terrifying puzzle and reveal how investigators finally tracked down the monster responsible for Derek's death. The discovery of the body was just the beginning of a revelation that would expose the true scope of Nathan Cross's crimes and the sophisticated network he had built to hunt victims in America's most remote wilderness areas. The positioning of Derek's body and the evidence of prolonged captivity transformed the investigation from a missing person case into one of the most disturbing homicide investigations in Alaska's history. The elaborate burial site demonstrated a level of premeditation and psychological sadism that suggested the perpetrator had experience with similar crimes. For Detective Warren and her team, Derek's grave was not just a crime scene, but a window into the mind of a predator who had been operating undetected in the wilderness for years. The forensic team worked for 3 days at the burial site, carefully documenting every detail of Derek's position, the condition of his equipment, and the construction of the grave itself. The evidence they collected would prove crucial in understanding not just how Derek had died, but how Nathan Cross had managed to capture and control an experienced mountaineer in one of the world's most hostile environments. The mountain had finally given up its secret, but the revelation only deepened the horror of what had transpired during those missing weeks in March and the months that followed. The forensic analysis of Derek's burial site revealed a methodical precision that chilled even seasoned investigators. The grave had been constructed with an engineer's attention to detail, taking advantage of natural snow accumulation patterns and wind directions to ensure the site would remain hidden indefinitely. Detective Warren's team discovered that the killer had used Derek's own mountaineering knowledge against him, exploiting the victim's understanding of snow science and avalanche safety to create a nearly perfect concealment system. Dr. Angela Foster, the state's chief medical examiner, conducted the autopsy under unprecedented security measures at the Anchorage facility. Her findings painted a horrific picture of Derek's final weeks that exceeded investigators' worst fears. The examination revealed that Derek had survived in captivity for approximately 3 weeks after his initial disappearance, during which time he had been systematically tortured and psychologically broken by his captor. Derek's body showed evidence of multiple restraint injuries, including rope burns on his wrists and ankles that had healed and reopened repeatedly, suggesting he had been bound and released multiple times during his captivity. More disturbing were the signs of deliberate nutritional deprivation and exposure, indicating that his captor had been carefully controlling his access to food, water, and shelter to maintain psychological dominance while keeping him alive. The psychological torture appeared to have been as systematic as the physical abuse. Derek's climbing gear had been modified and sabotaged in ways that would have been immediately apparent to an experienced mountaineer, creating a constant reminder of his helplessness and dependence on his captor. His journal, found in his pack, contained entries made during his captivity that revealed the depth of his psychological torment and his growing realization that he was being held by someone with extensive knowledge of mountaineering and survival techniques. The journal entries, written in Derek's increasingly shaky handwriting, provided investigators with their first direct insight into Nathan Cross's methods and motivations. Derek wrote about being approached by a friendly fellow climber who had offered assistance during the March 22 storm, only to be drugged and restrained when he accepted help. Cross had revealed his true identity gradually, describing his previous victims and explaining his systematic approach to hunting climbers in remote locations. According to Derek's journal, Cross had developed what he called a collection, preserving trophies from each of his victims in a hidden cache somewhere on Denali. The cache reportedly contained climbing gear, personal items, and photographic documentation of his crimes, creating a macabre museum of his activities over the past 4 years. Cross had forced Derek to help catalog items from previous victims, using the psychological pressure of handling dead climbers' equipment to break down his resistance. The journal also revealed Cross's selection criteria for his victims. He specifically targeted solo climbers with strong technical skills, viewing them as the ultimate challenge for his hunting activities. Cross had studied potential victims extensively, learning their climbing histories, planned routes, and personal backgrounds before making contact. His approach was always the same, offering assistance or partnership to isolated climbers before revealing his true intentions once they were completely dependent on him for survival. Detective Warren's team used Derek's journal entries to identify several additional potential victims beyond the 3 cases they had already connected to Cross. The descriptions of trophy items in Cross's cache matched equipment reported missing in unsolved disappearances across multiple states and countries. The scope of Cross's activities appeared to span nearly a decade, with victims in locations ranging from the Alaska Range to the Andes Mountains of South America. The investigation expanded internationally as Warren's team worked with law enforcement agencies in Canada, Chile, and Argentina to identify additional cases that might be connected to Cross's activities. Interpol issued a global alert for the suspect, distributing the various false identities he had used and warning climbing communities worldwide about his methods. The mountaineering world, typically a close-knit community built on trust and mutual assistance, recoiled in horror at the revelation that a predator had been operating in their midst for years. Meanwhile, the search for Cross himself intensified across Alaska. The state police deployed specialized tracking teams trained in wilderness manhunts, while the FBI contributed resources including satellite surveillance and behavioral analysis expertise. The operation was complicated by the vast scale of Alaska's wilderness and Cross's obvious expertise in outdoor survival, but investigators were confident that his extended presence in the state had left traces that could be followed. The breakthrough in locating Cross came from an unexpected source. On August 15, 2018, a bush pilot named Captain Roy Baldwin reported an unusual sighting during a supply flight to a remote research station in the Alaska Range. Baldwin had spotted what appeared to be a well-constructed shelter built into the side of a rocky outcropping approximately 30 miles from Denali, in an area that was rarely visited by climbers or researchers. The shelter was sophisticated enough to catch Baldwin's attention from the air, featuring camouflaged walls and a concealed entrance that suggested long-term occupation by someone with advanced survival skills. Most importantly, Baldwin reported seeing a figure near the shelter who had immediately sought cover upon hearing the aircraft, behavior consistent with someone trying to avoid detection by authorities. A joint task force comprising state police, FBI agents, and military special operations personnel was assembled for the assault on Cross's suspected hideout. The operation required careful planning due to the remote location and the likelihood that Cross was heavily armed and prepared for a siege. Helicopters inserted the tactical team at a safe distance from the shelter, allowing them to approach on foot under cover of darkness. The raid on Cross's mountain hideout on August 18 revealed the full extent of his criminal enterprise and the sophisticated nature of his operations. The shelter was actually a complex of interconnected caves and constructed rooms that had been developed over several years, featuring advanced amenities including solar power, communication equipment, and extensive food storage systems. The facility was clearly designed to support long-term habitation and had obviously been used as a base of operations for Cross's hunting activities across the region. The discovery that horrified investigators most was Cross's trophy room, a carefully organized space where he had preserved items from each of his victims along with detailed photographic documentation of their captures, captivity, and deaths. The collection included equipment and personal effects from at least 12 different climbers, representing cases spanning back to 2010 and covering multiple continents. Each victim section included climbing gear, identification documents, and photographs showing their condition at various stages of their captivity. But Nathan Cross himself was not at the hideout when the tactical team arrived. Evidence suggested he had abandoned the location recently, possibly within hours of the raid. The communication equipment showed signs of recent monitoring of law enforcement radio frequencies, indicating that Cross had been tracking the investigation and had fled when he realized authorities were closing in on his location. The manhunt for Cross expanded across the entire Pacific Northwest as investigators realized they were pursuing a suspect with extensive resources, sophisticated survival skills, and detailed knowledge of law enforcement procedures. The discovery of his hideout had provided crucial intelligence about his methods and the scope of his crimes, but it had also revealed that they were dealing with someone far more dangerous and organized than they had initially realized. If you want to know how this terrifying manhunt concluded and whether justice was finally served for Derek and Cross's other victims, continue following this investigation as we reveal the final confrontation that would end one of the most disturbing criminal cases in mountaineering history. The evidence recovered from Cross's hideout would eventually link him to 17 different disappearances across 4 countries, making him one of the most prolific serial killers ever to operate in wilderness settings. But finding physical evidence was only half the battle. Cross remained at large, armed and dangerous, with the skills and resources to evade capture indefinitely in the vast wilderness he had made his hunting ground. For the families of his victims and the mountaineering community worldwide, the question remained whether this monster would ever be brought to justice for his crimes. The manhunt for Nathan Cross became the largest wilderness search operation in Alaska's history, involving federal agents, state police, military personnel, and specialized tracking teams from across North America. The operation was coordinated from a command center established in Anchorage, where investigators used satellite imagery, thermal sensors, and advanced computer modeling to predict Cross's possible movements across the vast expanse of Alaska's backcountry. Cross's abandoned hideout provided investigators with crucial intelligence about his capabilities and resources. The sophisticated nature of his mountain complex revealed that he had been planning and preparing for years, accumulating supplies, weapons, and surveillance equipment that would allow him to operate independently in the wilderness for extended periods. His detailed maps showed intimate knowledge of remote areas across Alaska, Canada, and the lower 48 states, with marked locations that appeared to represent potential hiding spots and escape routes. The psychological profile developed by FBI behavioral analysts painted Cross as a highly intelligent and organized predator who had been escalating his activities over nearly a decade. His selection and hunting of victims showed careful planning and patience, with each crime building on lessons learned from previous attacks. The analysts warned that Cross would likely continue his killing spree if not captured, and that his experience evading authorities would make him increasingly dangerous to anyone who encountered him. On September 3, 2018, the investigation received a significant boost when Canadian authorities reported a possible sighting of Cross near the border between Alaska and British Columbia. A wildlife researcher conducting a survey in the remote Tatshenshini River area had encountered a man matching Cross's description who had been camping in an extremely isolated location. The researcher had found the encounter disturbing enough to report it to authorities, noting that the man had displayed extensive knowledge of the area and had asked suspicious questions about the researcher's schedule and planned movements. The sighting prompted a coordinated response between American and Canadian law enforcement, with teams positioned along potential escape routes while tracker specialists moved into the area where Cross had been spotted. The terrain was exceptionally challenging, consisting of dense forests, steep mountain slopes, and numerous river crossings that would test even experienced outdoorsmen. Cross's knowledge of the area gave him significant advantages, but investigators hoped that the pressure of constant pursuit would force him to make mistakes. The final confrontation came on September 12, 2018, in circumstances that none of the investigators had anticipated. Cross was not captured by the massive manhunt operation, but rather encountered a group of climbers who had been warned about his presence and were prepared for a dangerous encounter. The climbing team, led by veteran guide Michael Barnes, was attempting a remote peak in the Wrangell Mountains when they spotted an individual approaching their camp who matched Cross's description. Unlike Cross's previous victims, Barnes and his team were armed, experienced in wilderness survival, and had been briefed by authorities about Cross's methods and approach tactics. When Cross attempted his standard technique of offering assistance and friendship to gain access to their camp, Barnes immediately recognized the threat and confronted him directly. The encounter quickly escalated into violence when Cross realized his deception had been discovered. Cross was carrying multiple weapons, including climbing tools that had been modified into lethal instruments and a high-powered rifle that he had apparently stolen from one of his previous victims. The firefight that ensued lasted nearly 30 minutes, with Cross using his intimate knowledge of the terrain to move between covered positions while Barnes's team called for emergency assistance via satellite phone. The remote location meant that backup was hours away, leaving the climbing team to defend themselves against a heavily armed predator. The confrontation ended when Cross, apparently realizing that he was surrounded and that reinforcements were approaching, made a final desperate attempt to escape by rappelling down a steep cliff face. The rope he was using, possibly damaged by gunfire or weakened by the harsh conditions, failed during his descent. Cross fell nearly 200 feet onto a rocky ledge, sustaining injuries that proved fatal before rescue helicopters could reach the scene. When investigators finally reached Cross's body, they found evidence that confirmed his identity and linked him definitively to Derek's murder and the disappearances of numerous other climbers. His equipment included items stolen from victims, detailed notes about potential future targets, and photographs documenting his crimes in horrific detail. The recovery of this evidence provided closure for families who had been searching for answers about their missing loved ones for years. Derek's sister Amanda was among the family members who attended Cross's burial in an unmarked grave in Alaska, a simple ceremony that provided some measure of closure after months of uncertainty and investigation. She spoke publicly about her brother's love of the mountains and her hope that his death would lead to increased safety measures for solo climbers in remote areas. The Derek Lawson Memorial Foundation, established in his memory, now provides safety equipment and training for mountaineers and funds research into improving emergency communication systems for wilderness activities. The mountaineering community responded to Cross's crimes with a comprehensive review of safety protocols and communication procedures for remote expeditions. New guidelines were established requiring more frequent check-ins for solo climbers, enhanced background verification for climbing permits, and improved coordination between international law enforcement agencies to track suspicious activities across borders. The case also led to the development of new emergency beacon technology that is harder to disable or remove from climbers. The investigation into Cross's crimes ultimately identified 23 victims across 4 countries, making him one of the most prolific serial killers in history to operate specifically in wilderness settings. The recovery of evidence from his mountain hideout allowed authorities to close numerous missing person cases and provide answers to families who had been searching for their loved ones for years. Several bodies were recovered based on information found in Cross's detailed records, allowing for proper burial and memorial services. If you've been following this incredible investigation from the beginning, you now know the full scope of how one man's twisted obsession with hunting fellow climbers led to one of the most extensive manhunts in wilderness crime history. The case changed forever how authorities monitor and protect people who venture into remote areas, but it also revealed the dark reality that even in the most beautiful and isolated places on Earth, human evil can find a way to flourish. Dr. Foster's final report on the case noted that Derek's survival for 3 weeks in Cross's captivity demonstrated remarkable resilience and determination that likely saved other lives by providing crucial information about Cross's methods and hiding places. Derek's detailed journal entries, written under the most horrific circumstances imaginable, became the key evidence that allowed investigators to understand Cross's psychological profile and predict his behavior during the manhunt. The case officially closed on December 15, 2018, with Cross's death and the recovery of evidence linking him to crimes spanning nearly a decade. The Alaska State Police issued a final report acknowledging that while justice had been served, the case represented a systematic failure of various agencies to recognize the pattern of disappearances that Cross had been creating across multiple jurisdictions. New protocols were implemented to ensure better communication and information sharing between law enforcement agencies in different countries when dealing with crimes in remote wilderness areas. Derek Lawson's name is now inscribed on a memorial at Denali Base Camp, alongside other climbers who have lost their lives pursuing their passion in the mountains. His story serves as both a tribute to the courage and determination of mountaineers who push the boundaries of human exploration, and a sobering reminder that the greatest dangers in the wilderness are not always the natural ones. The mountains that Derek loved so much became both his final resting place and the scene of his ultimate victory over the evil that had claimed his life, providing the evidence necessary to ensure that Nathan Cross could never hurt another climber again. The legacy of Derek's case continues to influence mountaineering safety protocols worldwide, ensuring that his death contributed to protecting future generations of climbers who share his love of the world's most remote and beautiful places. In the end, the mountains that had seemed to swallow Derek Lawson completely were the very witnesses that brought his killer to justice and provided the closure that his family and the entire climbing community desperately needed.